when a student, struggling and anti-Trump, stepped into the parking lot that morning, she never could have guessed that the keys to a brand-new truck, along with a gift that would change her life, would come from the last person she'd expect at the most prestigious business school in New York, where old money and privilege dominate the halls. Barron Trump just proved that kindness, it knows no political lines. But before we dive in, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Now, picture this. Grace stands frozen, eyes locked on the brand-new Chevrolet Silverado in front of her. Her hands shake as she reaches for the note, tucked beneath the windshield wiper. Don't give up on your dreams. Use this to keep going. For your mom, for your future. The truck's emerald paint gleams under the morning sun, but what truly steals her breath? It's what she finds inside. In the glove compartment, an envelope, thick with cash, enough to erase her crushing student debt and cover her mother's medical bills. What makes this moment truly extraordinary isn't just Barron's unbelievable gesture. It's the fact that Grace was actually a part of one of the most outspoken anti-Trump student groups on campus. Unlike many of her peers, though, she never joined in on the loud chants or took part in protests. Instead, she'd just sit quietly in meetings, and whenever she passed Barron in class, she'd give him the same polite nod she offered to everyone else. What Grace never realized, Barron had been paying attention too. He noticed the exhaustion in her eyes. After those long commutes, the worn shoes she took extra care to maintain, and the phone calls she tried to keep private whenever her mother's medical bills came due. And what he decided to do about it, it would shake the very foundations of what everyone on campus thought they knew about privilege, politics, and the real meaning of compassion. Growing up in a small Ohio town, Grace understood the value of hard work. Her mother, a retired school teacher, raised her alone after Grace's father passed away when she was just 6. They didn't have much, but they had each other. And her mother? She made sure Grace never stopped chasing her dreams. When Grace earned admission to this prestigious business school on a partial scholarship, it felt like all those late-night study sessions had finally paid off. She was the first person from her high school to ever be accepted into such an elite university. The whole town celebrated, bake sales, car washes, anything to help get her to New York. But life, it has a way of testing us. Just 2 months before she was set to start at the university, her mother was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer. The doctors remained hopeful, but the treatment costs? Astronomical. Grace thought about giving up her admission, but her mother wouldn't even consider it. God didn't bring you this far to leave you here, she'd say, tears in her eyes. So, Grace packed her bags and found herself on the outskirts of New York, sharing a tiny apartment with 3 other students, commuting 2 hours each way to campus. Between classes, she worked shifts at a coffee shop, sending every spare dollar back home to help cover medical bills. Her student loans barely covered tuition, and every month new bills arrived, each one harder to pay than the last. At a university where most students drove luxury cars and wore designer clothes, Grace felt like she didn't belong. That's when she found the campus political groups. In a world where she often felt invisible, they at least offered a sense of community. She chose the anti-Trump group, though something about their constant anger always made her uneasy. But in a place where everyone seemed to belong somewhere, could she really afford to belong nowhere? What she didn't know, her quiet struggles hadn't gone unnoticed. In fact, someone had been watching, with growing concern, and that someone, their act of kindness, was about to turn Grace's world upside down, and challenge everything she thought she knew about the Trump family. Life at the university wasn't anything like she had imagined. Each morning, her day started at 4:30 a.m., catching the first train out of New Jersey, just to make it in time for her 8 a.m. class. Those train rides became her study hall, textbooks balanced on her lap, highlighter in hand, fighting exhaustion just to keep up. Some days, she had to choose between buying lunch or saving that money for her mother's medication. The contrast between her life and that of her classmates was impossible to ignore. While they complained about their favorite restaurants being fully booked, Grace sat quietly in the library, eating a packed sandwich, and using that time to catch up on assignments. Her worn shoes, her simple clothes, they stood out in a sea of Gucci and Prada. But she held her head high, her mother's words echoing in her mind. Dignity was worth far more than any designer label. During advanced economics, she often noticed Barron Trump, sitting just a few rows ahead. But unlike what the anti-Trump group claimed, he wasn't arrogant. He wasn't flashy. He took notes with focus, helped classmates when they struggled, and never once flaunted his last name. Every now and then, their eyes would meet, and he'd offer a small, knowing smile, the kind that made Grace wonder, could he see past the facade she worked so hard to maintain? The anti-Trump group met every Thursday in the student center. Grace always sat in the back, nodding along, but never jumping into the heated debates. She noticed how their voices dropped whenever Barron came up in conversation, how they whispered gossip and made assumptions about him. But something about their words felt hollow, especially when, the very next day, she'd see him quietly helping a struggling classmate grasp a tough concept. But everything changed. That rainy Tuesday morning, Grace had just gotten off another exhausting phone call with the hospital's billing department. Her mother's latest treatment had drained their emergency fund, and the next round was coming up fast. She wiped away tears, sitting alone in an empty classroom, not realizing that Barron had been walking past the door, not seeing him pause, his face clouded with concern, as he overheard her desperate conversation. That evening, as Grace prepared for another long commute home, she had no idea that Barron Trump was about to set something in motion, something that would change not just her life, but also challenge everything people thought they knew about wealth, privilege, and what compassion truly means. Barron had noticed Grace from their very first shared class, not because she was part of the anti-Trump group. By now, he was used to that, but because she was different. While others shouted slogans, she remained quiet. While they glared at him, she simply focused on her studies. But what really caught his attention? The small details most people overlooked. Her shoes, neatly polished, but wearing thin. How she'd save half her coffee for later in the day, just to avoid buying another one. The way she sometimes dozed off during morning lectures, exhausted from what he later learned was a brutal daily commute. That rainy Tuesday changed everything. Barron had been heading to the library when he overheard Grace's phone call with the hospital. Her voice, usually steady, composed, was breaking. She begged for more time to pay her mother's medical bills, and something in her tone struck a nerve. It reminded him of his own mother's words about responsibility, about compassion. In this world, Melania had once told him, people will judge you before they know you, but true character isn't about who they think you are. It's about what you do when no one's watching. That evening, Barron made some calls. First, to the dealership. He'd seen Grace admiring Silverados online during class breaks. Then, to his bank, arranging for the funds her mother desperately needed, not for recognition, not to prove anything to his critics, but because he truly believed that when you have the power to help someone, you have the responsibility to do it. As he penned the note to go with his gift, Barron knew exactly how his actions would be misinterpreted. Some would call it showing off. Others would search for a political motive. But none of that mattered. What truly mattered was that somewhere in Ohio, a mother would receive the treatment she needed, and her daughter wouldn't have to choose between her education and her mother's life. The morning Grace found the Silverado, that moment would be forever etched into campus history. Standing in the parking lot, she read the note over and over, her hands trembling. Inside the glove compartment, an envelope, thick with cash. Enough, not just for her mother's next round of treatment, but to cover the entire cost of her care. For the first time in months, Grace felt like she could breathe. No more choosing between medical bills and textbooks. No more grueling 2-hour commutes on crowded trains. No more lying to her mother, pretending she had enough to eat. The weight of constant worry, it lifted, replaced by something she hadn't felt in so long, hope. But it wasn't just about the money or the truck. It was about something deeper, being seen. Someone had noticed her struggle, understood her pain, and reached out with exactly what she needed, and that someone was Barron Trump, the very person her political group spent so much time criticizing. Grace sat in the driver's seat, tears streaming down her face, as she called her mother. "Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're going to get better. We can afford the treatment now." On the other end of the line, her mother began to cry, too. Who is our guardian angel?" she asked. Grace glanced across the parking lot, where Barron was heading to class, his head down, acting as if he hadn't just changed someone's entire world. That evening, as Grace drove home, a trip that now took only 30 minutes, instead of 2 hours, her mind raced. The quiet kindness she'd witnessed, the very person her group had labeled as privileged, as out of touch, had shown more understanding of her struggles than anyone else ever had. But the real storm, it was just beginning. Word of the gift spread across campus like wildfire, and Grace's anti-Trump group, they were about to reveal their true colors, in a way that would force her to question everything she thought she knew about loyalty, about politics, and about what it really means to judge someone's character. News spreads fast on campus, especially when a Trump is involved. By the next morning, everyone had heard about the mysterious green Silverado parked outside. The anti-Trump group's leadership called an emergency meeting. For the first time, Grace felt a knot in her stomach as she walked into their gathering. Jessica, the group's leader, smirked as she leaned forward. "So," she said, her tone icy, "someone's been keeping secrets." The room suddenly felt smaller. All eyes locked on Grace. A brand new truck, medical bills paid off, and you didn't think to mention who it came from. Grace sat up straighter in her chair. "I don't see how that's anyone's business," she replied. But her voice, it wavered just slightly. The same faces that had welcomed her months ago, now they stared with suspicion, with barely concealed hostility. "It is our business," another member snapped. "When one of us accepts blood money from the enemy." The word rang in Grace's ears. She thought of Barron, how he never reacted to their taunts, how he helped struggling students in study groups, how he noticed her needs when even her so-called friends hadn't. "The enemy?" Grace heard herself say, her voice steady now. "The only enemy I see is poverty and illness. And while you were all busy planning your next protest, Barron Trump was the only one who actually did something to help someone in need." The room erupted. "Traitor!" someone shouted. Jessica stepped forward, her designer heels clicking on the floor. "You have a choice, Grace," she said, voice sharp. "Reject this blood money, stand with us, or you're out. And trust me, you don't want to be our enemy." Grace looked around at the people she once thought were her friends, and that's when she realized something that would change everything. She wasn't the only one wearing a mask, but while hers had been worn out of necessity, theirs were worn out of choice. Choice. That word echoed in her mind as she rose from her seat, meeting every gaze in the room. The same people who claimed to fight for justice, for equality, now they were threatening her because she'd accepted help that would save her mother's life. "My mother is dying." Grace's voice cut through the room like a blade. "She's dying, and not one of you ever asked how I was doing. Not one of you noticed that I've been wearing the same 3 outfits all semester. Not one of you offered to help when I fell asleep in study group because I was exhausted from working double shifts." The room fell silent. Even Jessica's smug expression faltered. But Barron noticed. Grace's voice grew stronger. He didn't just notice. He did something about it. No cameras. No social media posts. No political statements. Just pure kindness. Jessica's eyes flashed. "He's manipulating you," she snapped. "This is what they do. They buy people's loyalty. Grace let out a bitter laugh. Loyalty? She shook her head. You want to talk about loyalty? Where was your loyalty? When I needed help? Where was your compassion? When I was choosing between buying textbooks and paying for my mother's medication? She grabbed her bag. Her hands, steady now. And then she said something that made the whole room go silent. You know what's funny? That note he left me, it didn't say a single word about politics. It didn't ask for anything in return. All it said was, "Don't give up on your..." As Grace reached the door, she turned back one last time. You all claim to fight for the little people, but when one of your own needed help, you were too busy planning protests to notice. Maybe it's time to ask yourselves who the real privileged ones are. The next morning, Grace spotted Barron, sitting alone in the library's quiet study area. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached his table. But she knew this conversation had to happen. "Thank you," she said softly, sliding into the chair across from him. "I don't even know where to begin to express my gratitude." Barron glanced up from his textbook, that same gentle smile she'd seen in class, appearing once again. "You don't have to thank me, Grace." "But I do," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "Not just for the truck or the money, but for seeing me, for understanding." She hesitated, gathering the courage for what she needed to say next. "I need to confess something." Barron closed his book, giving her his full attention. "I joined that group because..." Grace's eyes welled with tears. "I was so lost when I got here. Everything was overwhelming. The wealth, the pressure, my mom's illness. I thought if I joined them, I'd finally belong somewhere. I never believed the things they said about your family, but I was too scared to be alone." She expected judgment in his eyes. Instead, she found only understanding. "You know," Barron replied thoughtfully, "my father always says, the loudest voices usually belong to the most insecure people. But it's the quiet ones, the ones who work hard without complaining, who help others without seeking credit. Those are the ones who truly make America great." Grace wiped away a tear. "I left the group yesterday," she admitted. "They wanted me to reject your help, to choose their ideology over my mother's life." "And what did you choose?" Barron asked, though his knowing smile suggested he already knew the answer. "I chose truth," Grace replied. "I chose gratitude over grudges. I chose to see people for who they are, not for who others tell me they should be." Word of Grace's confrontation with the anti-Trump group, it spread fast. But unlike the usual campus narratives, this one was different. This wasn't just about politics. This was a story about real people, real struggles, and real kindness. Students who had never spoken up before started sharing their own experiences. A sophomore revealed how Barron had tutored him in economics for weeks, refusing to take any payment. A cafeteria worker shared how Barron had quietly paid for a student's meal plan when she ran out of funds. Small acts of kindness, overlooked for so long because they didn't fit the expected narrative. The anti-Trump group, they tried to spin the story, claiming Grace had been bought off. but their accusations fell flat, because the moment Grace's mother arrived on campus for her next treatment, paid for by Barron's gift, it changed everything. The sight of Grace hugging her tearful mother in the parking lot, both of them thanking God for their guardian angel, that did more to change hearts than any protest ever could. You know what the craziest part is? Grace told a friend one day, as they watched the anti-Trump group's numbers dwindle. They're so busy fighting against what they think wealth and privilege look like, they can't even recognize true privilege, the privilege of being able to help others, and doing it without expecting anything in return. Even professors noticed the shift. Classroom discussions became less about political divisions and more about understanding different perspectives. The same students who once sneered at Barron, now they watched thoughtfully as he continued his quiet acts of kindness, never seeking attention, never asking for praise. But the real change, it was happening in the hearts of those who had witnessed this story unfold, because they were starting to realize, sometimes, the greatest acts of courage aren't in loud protests or viral social media posts. Sometimes, they're as simple as seeing someone in need and quietly reaching out to help. 3 months later, Grace stood at the podium in the university's main auditorium. The occasion? A new scholarship program for students struggling with family medical emergencies, inspired by her story, but quietly funded by the Trump family. When I first came to this university, she began, her voice steady and clear. I thought I knew everything about privilege, power, and politics. I joined groups that claimed to fight for justice, but I learned that true justice isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about seeing the humanity in each other, in the audience. Her mother, now in remission, wiped away tears. Beside her, Barron, doing his best to avoid attention, despite being the reason. They were all gathered there. You know, Grace continued, it's easy to label people, to put them in boxes, based on their last name, or their political affiliation. I did that too. But then, someone I was supposed to hate showed me more kindness than those who claimed to be on my side. She locked eyes with her former group members in the audience. This isn't about politics. It's about what happens when we stop letting others tell us who to love and who to hate. It's about what's possible when we lead with kindness instead of judgment. Her voice softened as she delivered her final words. To the student who feels lost, who's struggling to keep up appearances, while fighting battles nobody sees, someone notices. And to those who can help others, be like Barron. Don't wait for cameras or credit. Just do what's right. The applause that followed, it wasn't just for her speech. It was for every assumption challenged, every prejudice overcome, and every life changed by one person's quiet act of kindness. As Grace stepped down from the podium, she knew she was exactly where she belonged, not in any group, not in any political camp, but in a place of truth, of gratitude, and authentic compassion. And if this story touched you, don't forget to like and subscribe. Because sometimes the most powerful acts of kindness are the ones nobody is watching.